Generating traffic and sales can be a challenge for online merchants. But selling on the Walmart Marketplace puts your products in front of millions of customers who shop on Walmart.com. And right now, sellers who join Walmart Marketplace can save up to 50% on referral and fulfillment fees for the first 90 days. So get started today. Head over to marketplace.walmart.com/savings. That's marketplace.walmart.com/savings.
Welcome to E-Commerce Conversations, a podcast by Practical E-Commerce.
Hello, I'm Armando Roggio, and this is an e-commerce conversation from Practical E-Commerce. David Maister, a former Harvard Business School professor, said that customer satisfaction was the product of the customer's perception minus that same customer's expectation. So if you want satisfied customers, your business needs to provide a level of perceived service that's greater than your customer's expectations. Now, for e-commerce, shipping is customer satisfaction's front line. And online sellers should aim to meet shoppers' expectations for fast and free shipping. Today, we're going to speak to Nathan Jones, the president and CEO of ShipStation, a web-based software solution designed to help e-commerce retailers process, fulfill, and ship their orders. Nathan, thank you. I appreciate you joining me for this e-commerce conversation.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So as I just mentioned in the opening, we're going to talk about customer expectations for shipping. So I just want to start with this. Let's imagine that you go online personally and you make a purchase. How soon do you expect an order to arrive?
Well, it's a great question. It's really at the heart of every e-commerce transaction. At the very minimum, you expect it to be delivered when the website says it's going to be delivered. So that's the most important first impression to give, is if you say it's going to be 2 weeks, then it needs to be within 2 weeks. If you say it's going to be 2 days, it needs to be 2 days. But I think that something has taken over in the last decade, largely pushed, I think, by initiatives by Amazon and a few other companies as well, to drive that expectation universally down to something that feels like near instantaneous delivery. So whereas traditionally we were happy to wait a few days or even a few weeks in some cases for products, now if you don't get it to somebody within 2 days, they immediately feel like the expectation hasn't been met that's been set by what is perceived to be the industry as a whole, though really it's largely just a handful of retailers that have set that model or that lead for everyone else to follow.
Do you think that this is something that's generally good for e-commerce? I mean, one of the things that I guess e-commerce does compete against is the ability to go in and buy something in a store and carry that product home. So is it a good thing that some of these leading retailers are sort of pushing the envelope on delivery?
I think for the category of e-commerce in general, it's definitely healthy. It does make it more difficult to run a business. It makes it harder to meet the standards imposed, but it also offsets the argument against traditional retail, so the e-tail advantage over traditional brick and mortar retail. You walk into a store because you can get something today. People have sort of adjusted those expectations over time to say, well, what if I could just get it tomorrow or the day after tomorrow? Is that fast enough? Is that really practically the same as today? And does that offset the time it takes to get to, hop in a car and go to the store, and then, time invested in that whole process? So I think overall, it's very good for e-tail to set that standard, for e-commerce to set that standard, because people having that set of expectations means that when they go to shop for something, their first impulse isn't to see it as a different experience any more than walking into retail in terms of delivery. There is a practical point that it doesn't have to be in your hands within an hour to feel almost the same as having it in your hands within an hour. 2 days seems to be heading in that direction strongly. Over time, we may see that compress a little bit more even than the 2-day standards, but it definitely offsets one of the key disadvantages to shopping online, the perceptions of shopping online, which is that it's slower. I think that's obviously to the benefit of the companies that execute it really well, but as a halo effect, because the expectation is there across the industry now, even for companies that don't, in general, ship at that pace, they still benefit from the general feeling of people that you can get things almost as fast shopping online as you can shopping locally.
So just to make sure that I understood that, so even though my own e-commerce business may not be able to deliver as rapidly as, say, Amazon, I'm still going to have customers who are going to be willing to buy from me versus going into a brick and mortar store because they have this expectation that online shipping is quick.
That's right, and I'll illustrate that point by reversing the scenario. For a number of years, the fear of fraud, even though most customers weren't victims of fraud online, the fear of fraud prevented customers from adopting online purchasing in mass. And so it's an example where the exact opposite scenario occurs in terms of something negative paints everyone, well, positive paints everyone too. So to the extent that retailers, especially high-profile retailers, are able to create more smooth experiences for a large number of customers, the general impression of the market gets better. To the extent that people did a bad job 15 years ago with security and credit cards got stolen, that did a disservice, and it hurt e-commerce sellers, even ones who were never responsible for fraud in the first place or had great protections in place to prevent consumer fraud. So, it really works both directions. And in this case, the smaller retailers happen to benefit from a halo effect or a positive, effect left in the wake of the big sellers, blazing new trails on fast delivery.
So a minute ago, when I asked you about, what your expectations were as a consumer shopping online, you mentioned that the expectations were often set by the retailer. Let's take the case of like a mid-market online retail business. What are some of the things that I can do or that company can do during the shopping process, during the checkout process, to set a good, proper expectation for how quickly something will be delivered?
Well, obviously, communicating clearly with the customer up front, just plain English, plain writing, usually delivers in or will deliver in setting the number of days that it takes to deliver it is important. If you've done that, the next most important thing is just execute on it every time correctly. And that means orders have to get out of the online the online store that was sold at it into a warehouse within a very short time period. When a customer sees that something ships within 2 days, sometimes a company will write that, and misleadingly what they mean is we will ship it in 2 days. Now, plus it's going to have its transit time on top of there. So it may be 2 to air, we'll ship it within 2 days, well, you'll have it in 4 days. Making sure those kind of confusions are eliminated at the point of sale is really important. If you say usually ships in 2 days, that doesn't necessarily clearly say the same as usually delivers in 2 days. So you just have to be really clear at checkout and make sure you're making it, no opportunity for the customer to misunderstand when they're going to get it. I think that's just incredibly important in today's e-commerce to be competitive, to make sure customers know that, because it is an expectation they're coming in with. If you're able to meet that service expectation of a short turn or quick delivery, you really owe it to yourself to make sure the customer knows that. And if you're not going to be able to give them the delivery experience that they may be used to, they may be used to buying things on, say, an Amazon Prime seller and get things in 2 days every time without even thinking about it. If you're not going to deliver that, you better make sure they're clear that that's not the case either, because even if you get the sale either way, the key part is expectation not met is the single biggest cause of lack of consumer confidence with a given brand.
So let's say that I am going to try to meet that. I am going to try to deliver in very quickly, 2 or 3 days. What are some of the things that an online retail business can do, other than just choosing a faster service level from a carrier? What are some of the things I can do to equip my business, I guess, to be able to deliver very, very quickly in just a few days?
Well, that's a great question, and that's really the core of what our business is. You have to arm yourself with technology and tools that make the time from when an order is placed to when it leaves your warehouse as short as possible. And a lot of companies get burned because they may possess, anyone can put a package in the hands of a carrier and say, please deliver it in 2 days or 3 days or 5 days or whatever the time window that they've agreed with the customer to deliver it in. But a lot of companies get burned because their internal processing is slow. And so it's not actually time on a truck that causes the delay. It's time required to get the order from their system into their warehouse and then into a box and then onto a truck. That is entirely within the control of the user today. Years ago, you had to build really sophisticated systems in order to go and process things very quickly. But with products like ours, we've really eliminated a good portion of the amount of time required to manage the operations of a business on the fulfillment side. So you place an order, it shows up in through a system like, say, ShipStation. Within minutes, you can have that item on the warehouse floor being packed in. Customers have to realize that the delivery methods or the delivery timeframes are so driven by how fast you get it out of your warehouse, and that's where so much of the control is, that adopting technology that helps with that is incredibly important. Amazon's one example of many. I've used them multiple times in this conversation, but Amazon's a good example of a company that does that really well. When you place an order with Amazon, you only have a handful of minutes to cancel that order before it's too late to cancel it, because they're so efficient at getting it out, into their warehouse floor to be picked. And that, at one point required a huge investment in technology and infrastructure. We've eliminated that. We make that incredibly inexpensive to do. All an e-commerce seller has to do now is just be aware enough of the fulfillment experience and the fulfillment from the consumer.
I like that. What you're saying really is take the thing that you have the most control over and really master that, so that you're getting a lot of your delivery time savings right there in the thing that you have your hands on.
That's correct. It's easy to look at what other companies do and think that it's voodoo, that they must have some special relationship with the carriers, and there's a helicopter waiting in their warehouse to carry their stuff to the airport in an instant. It's really not it. The thing they do is they just make the decision of how to ship it and get it in a box as simple and quick as possible. That's the part you can control. And if you control that, you're on even footing with anyone in the industry. Nobody can deliver it faster than you can if you just put it in the box right away.
I agree with that 100%. Another thing that comes to mind here, though, is that also if I have more than one warehouse that I can ship out of, maybe a warehouse located in one part of the country or another, I can also gain some time, not just in how quickly I can process it through my warehouse, but then in how close the package already is, if that makes sense, to the customer. What do you think about a strategy like that as well?
Well, we're talking about distributed inventory, right? So we're keeping inventory in multiple locations around the country. Now you're taking control of the carrier side of the relationship. So the biggest initial hurdle is control your warehouse, control getting the order out of your hands as quickly as possible. Now you get the chance to cut the delivery times even shorter by shipping it from closer to the customer's delivery location. Obviously, a great idea. Not everyone has the scale to take advantage of that. It's not cheap to warehouse in multiple places. But once you do, having a system that lets you route that efficiently across there does you two services. One, it lets you surprise and exceed the customer's expectation, because the customer may have expected it in a handful of days, but because you shipped it from closer, they get a little bit faster. There's one opportunity to do that. The other thing you get to do with that is even just meeting the customer's expectation as you were going to anyway, you get to use a less expensive method. And that's really important for e-tailers as they grow, to think about how do they cut costs out of the operations side of the equation. Being able to efficiently say, I can ship from UPS ground because this is coming from a warehouse that's 1 day away, even by ground, or that's 2 days away, and I've made a 2-day commitment. I don't have to use a 2-day air solution, which costs obviously a substantially larger amount of money. So at that point, you have the choice whether you want to surprise your customer by showing up early with the package, or show up on time but at a much lower cost of fulfillment. And those are very interesting choices to make, and customers, every different seller is going to have a different vision of what for their customer is the better outcome. Less expensive product ultimately, or a faster delivery than they expected. But distributed warehousing is a really powerful tool, and it's becoming more accessible with the proliferation of 3PLs, where I no longer have to run my own warehouse in multiple locations. I can use somebody else's warehouse in another location, so I can store smaller amounts of money with inventory with a much lower commitment, financial commitment, because I don't have to pay the cost of scaling up an entire warehouse. I can just rent a little piece of a warehouse from someone else, and they can supply all the labor and all the management required for it. So it's definitely a huge trend we're seeing a lot of in the industry. As we go on, we see a substantial number of our customers getting involved in at least in a little bit of third-party warehousing. Whether their primary shipments come through there or they just use it for farther regional shipments or specific categories of products. Varies by seller.
So I'm going to try just to continue to bring this back to our initial point, which was meeting customer expectations. So we started by talking about just communicating well to the customer upfront about how long a package is going to take. And then your suggestion next was to just focus on that thing you can control the most, how quickly you can get the order out of your warehouse and on its way to the customer. And then using distributed warehousing as kind of a means to talk about it, we basically said the next step would be this sort of logistics planning and processing where you're trying to win back some of the time that comes from the carriers by either shipping from someplace closer to the customer or using those kinds of tactics. Other things that jump to mind right now for me are zone skipping, things like that. But basically that's that logistics planning phase. I want to kind of come back a little bit, if I can, and ask you about the cost. We already mentioned that having distributed warehouses might lower the cost of fast shipping to you. What are a couple of other tips if a retailer feels like they need to offer free shipping? What are a couple of other tips that you might have for keeping the cost of shipping down?
Great question. It's a big concern at all times. So, of course, there are operational ways we reduce costs with customers, and those deal with just being more efficient at helping them process and make decisions about where packages route. But there are some fundamental go-to things that customers should really be thoughtful of and critical of. First is customers should all look at potentially a multi-carrier solution. So all customers should be thinking about more than just one carrier when they are considering the fulfillment options. A lot of times a small seller will start up and they'll be lured in by saying, we just want to work with UPS or we just want to work with FedEx. And they pick up one carrier and they stop at that. And that's great for a lot of shipments, but carriers have different strengths and weaknesses. We found that with, say, customers adding on USPS, or many customers start with USPS, that USPS, for example, may have great coverage for delivery routes that they want at a really great price for certain packages in a certain weight class. But as you get to a different weight class, you might want to choose another carrier or consider another carrier as an option. There is some value in trying to consolidate shipments for rates with certain carriers, but usually your offset, that's almost always offset by losing out on benefits in some weight classes and some routes and zones of shipping. So depending on what you're shipping and where you're shipping it, you're going to get a different value from different people for carrying those packages, and a different price from different people carrying those packages, but still meeting all the same delivery time frame. And a young merchant or an early merchant or early startup can do is be mindful of all the options. For a number of years, USPS wasn't considered front of mind for e-commerce shipping, and we find a lot of people when they first start don't consider them as a carrier that's relevant in e-commerce shipping. But we have some great statistics that tell us that they're really worth talking to, right? They're worth having at the table when you interface with them. But the same is true for UPS and FedEx, and there are a lot of other carriers as well. That might be serve a different type of market. DHL, if they're functioning in your area, has some value. There's lots of regional carriers like Lone Star that might serve a couple of states, right, or on track. Looking at all the options for carriers is a great way to find savings that you might not have realized were there. And some cases even shorten delivery cycles for some runs or some legs of the operation. All that's made more complicated, of course, if you're having to do it by hand or if you're manually trying to manage everything. But when you adopt, quality technology, it can really greatly help facilitate a much more efficient decision-making process. There's a huge amount of savings to be had in that for a savvy seller. There's other things that customers should always be thinking of as well, which is, obviously we talked about 3PLs, but there's also other ways of dealing with inventory, like, for example, drop shipping inventory. Not every customer needs to take possession of a deep inventory if they're not manufacturing, but if they're resellers, they don't have to take possession of all the inventory themselves. They can drop ship their long tail items instead of trying to stock them. They can use some forecasting tools to be more thoughtful about ordering inventory on a just-in-time basis, so they're not sitting on inventory unnecessarily. Because the last thing you want to do is tie up cash flow in inventory that's not flying off the shelf today. So everything you can do to shorten that cycle and to get your hands wrapped around what you can do to keep inventory at the minimum levels required to meet your fulfillment commitments. That's a really important thing to do to optimize your business.
With everything we've been talking about, we've been sort of working around the expectations for fast and free delivery on the front end. What about for returns?
Returns is an interesting conversation. Everyone has questions about returns because returns have a couple of different scenarios where returns are concerned. One is the cost of getting returns back. There's just the merchandise itself. That's a customer level policy. If you're gonna, whether you accept returns or not, or under what circumstances you accept returns, we see a general trend towards merchandise being returnable in most cases. We see that most we have tens of thousands of users inside of ShipStation that accept returns very generously. Once you're doing that, you're back to another problem of managing operations. How quickly can a customer, how efficiently can a customer get a return label in their hands or get permission to return something? How do you track the product once it comes inside? Again, that's a thing that technology choice can make a real difference on. We've put a lot of work into making returns as easy as possible inside of ShipStation. Returns is an interesting logistics scenario from a carrier perspective because unlike shipping out to the customer where there's a definite time expectation, oftentimes returns can come back by a completely alternate carrier that was used to deliver it because the timeliness of getting something back is usually not as important as the timeliness of delivering it. So if someone gets a shirt, it's the wrong size, they ordered it, you promised it in 2 days, receiving it back in stock doesn't have to come by 2-day air. You can receive it back in stock by a ground service. It's much slower because there's very little gain to you or your customer in having it back in a hurry. But there's a lot of benefit to the merchant in saving money on the shipping. So being thoughtful about that. Also, managing the interactions with the customer in that process. It's a time-intensive process to talk to a customer about a return. We've built a system that allows a customer to self-service on a return if a merchant, will let them do that. So if a merchant chooses that option, then, the customer can, or the merchant can then allow the customer to log into their own order, select the items they want to return, apply that against a rules engine that decides whether they're allowed to return it, and then get a label and return information subsequent to that, based on their eligibility for the return. That's great because it takes for a customer with a standard return, which is no longer needed, or it's the wrong size, or something that falls into a pretty straightforward return policy. It saves the merchant the time of having to interact with the customer on that front, and that's really important because small to medium-sized merchants, everyone benefits from this, but it's particularly important for small to medium-sized merchants because they're often not staffed with full-time service teams or service teams that are capable of scaling up on demand for several returns simultaneously or a large number of returns simultaneously. So you have a real issue there of trying to find staff to be available to meet the customer's expectation, which is, I want to return this and I would like to get this off my plate right now. And if you're not available to talk to me or your staff is queued up, 5 deep on or 10 deep on customer service calls or return calls or whatever, you've now failed to meet the customer's expectation. And we think that the technology choices can dramatically alter that, and customers find that to be a very reassuring part of a brand. The ability to return something means that I have a much higher confidence on my willingness to buy something. So particularly users that are selling goods that are not commoditized, things that I don't, if I'm buying a standard monitor from someone, it's the same monitor that I've always used, and I'm just buying a replacement, I have no fear. But if I'm buying a shoe, or hopefully 2 shoes, if I'm buying shirts, if I'm buying something that's bespoke or sized for me, the ability to return that is really important in case I make a mistake. So trust goes way up when you make returns easy.
Last question for our conversation. So best guess, where are customer expectations for shipping going to be in the next 3 years or 5 years?
That's a great question. It's still highly speculative. I'll engage in the speculation, but with the disclaimer that it's hard to predict the future, but what we can do is look at the past and sort of use that as a guide. What we find is that no matter what you give to any other human, we adjust our expectations to find that to be the norm, and then someone else has a chance to step up and do better. So every time we put out an experience, all the market does is rush to improve on it. So today we're looking at, kind of a general industry standard expectation that 2-day delivery should be free for most type of products, particularly if they can be bought from multiple sellers, right? So if I'm the only one selling a thing, I might be able to capture non-2-day shipping, non-free 2-day shipping, or handle shipping a different way. But if I'm selling something that can be bought someplace else, often the winner is going to be the place that's shipping it for free by 2-day air. Over time, all that's going to happen is what has always happened, is that time's going to shorten. You're just going to see it go down. So, more regional stocking, more regional fulfillment, meaning distributed inventory levels so that things can get there faster. I think it's only going to shorten that. And for the people who can participate in delivery networks that can get delivery down to same day, I think in 3 years you're going to see a considerably larger percentage of goods shipped, by that method. That's going to require collaboration between, between merchants across industries where, one company that might be able to distribute warehouses all across the country, all the other people that want to compete with them are going to have to form alternate ways of accomplishing that same thing. So I think you're going to see a tighter cooperation between the non-giant big box resellers. You're going to see a cross-industry collaboration over time that's going to enable that delivery functionality to materialize. Whereas right now it's difficult for people to envision how that would be possible. But I think it's coming, and I think it's going to deal with a lot of collaboration across merchants that aren't all one giant monolithic company.
Nathan, I really appreciate you taking time today to join me for this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it and really enjoyed it.